26, Martin was in fact jittery, and considerably so. He kept goal for Trinity, his team, after a keen struggle, had reached the finals, and that day was to meet St. John's for the Cambridge University Championship. Martin was proud that he, a foreigner, had made the first team, and for his brilliant play had qualified for the title of College Blue, entitling him to wear a splendid light blue blazer. He would now recollect with pleasant amazement his childhood days in Russia, when curled up in a soft hollow of the nursery night, and having abandoned himself to reveries that would imperceptibly bear him off to sleep, he would see himself as a crack footballer. It was enough for him to close his eyes and picture a soccer field, or say the long brown diaphragm-jointed cars of an express that he was driving himself, and his mind would gradually catch the rhythm, grow blissfully serene, be cleansed, as it were, and sleek and oiled slip into oblivion, instead of a train going full tilt, gliding through bright yellow birch forests that above foreign cities, across bridges that spanned streets, and on southward through tunnels that had their own sudden daybreak, and along the shore of a dazzling sea. It might be an airplane, a race car, a bobsleigh, taking a sharp turn in a whirl of flying snow, or else simply a forest path along which you can run and run. As he reminisced, Martin noted a certain peculiarity about his life, the property that his reveries had of crystallizing and mutating into reality, as previously they had mutated into sleep. This seemed to him a guarantee that the new series of reveries he had revelantly evolved about an illegal clandestine expedition would also grow solid and be filled with life, as his dreams about soccer matches had grown solid and incarnate, those dreams in which he used to luxuriate so lengthily, so artfully, when afraid to reach the delicious essence too quickly. He would dwell in detail the pre-game preparations, pulling on the stockings with colored tops, putting on the black shorts, tying the laces of the robust boots. He grunted and unbent. It was warm changing near his fireplace, and this helped in a way to dilute the tremor of his excitement. The celestial blazer buttoned smugly over the white but knee-necked sweater. How worn were his goalkeeper's gloves! There, he was ready. His clothes lay all around where he had discarded them. He gathered everything up and carried it into the bedroom. Compared with the warmth of the woolen sweater, his bare-kneed legs felt wonderfully cool in their roomy, light shorts. "Whew," he said as he entered Darwin's room. "You can't say I didn't change fast." "Let's go," said Sonia, getting up from the sofa. Teddy gave her a beseeching look. "I beg 1,000 pardons," he implored, "but believe me, I can't come with you. I'm expected elsewhere." He left. Vadim also left, promising to cycle over to the playing fields later. "Maybe it really isn't so interesting after all," said Sonia, addressing Darwin. "Perhaps we might as well not go?" "No, we'll go by all means," said Darwin, with a smile, giving Martin a squeeze on the shoulder. As the three of them set out along the street, Martin noticed that Sonia never looked at him once, and yet this was the first time he had appeared before her in soccer array. "Let's walk a little faster," he said, "or else we may be late." "No great harm in that," said Sonia, stopping in front of a shop window. "All right, I'll go on ahead," said Martin, and thumping firmly with the rubber cleats of his boots, took a short cut through an alley and strode off toward the pitch. Quite a lot of spectators had turned out, owing partly to the fine day with its pale blue wintry sky and brisk air. Martin went on into the pavilion where the other players had already gathered. Armstrong, the team captain, a lanky fellow with a clipped mustache, smiled shyly as he told Martin for the 100th time that he ought to wear knee guards. A moment later all 11 players trotted single file out of the pavilion, and Martin felt a beloved blend of impressions: the sharp smell of the damp turf, its resilience underfoot, thousands of people in stands, the black bare spot in front of the goal, and the thud of the ball kicked around by the other team. The referee brought out and placed within the white circle of the field's hub a brand new light yellow ball. The players got into position and the whistle blew. At that instant Martin's nervousness vanished, and calmly leaning against the left upright, he glanced around in search of Darwin and Sonia. The action was taking place at the opposite end of the pitch, and he could revel in the cold air, and the matte green of the turf, and the chatter of people standing just behind the goal net, and the glory of feeling that his boyhood dream had come true, that the red-haired chap over there, the St. John's captain, was receiving and passing the ball with such exquisite accuracy, had recently played against Scotland, and that there was somebody in the crowd for whom it was worth making a special effort. In childhood years, sleep would overtake him just in those opening minutes of the game, for Martin would get so engrossed in the details of the preface that he never got to the main part of the text. Thus, he would protract the delight, postponing to another, less sleepy night, the game itself, bright and swift, and the pouncing of feet getting closer, and now he could hear the panting of the attack as the redhead broke loose. And there he came, his shock of hair bobbing, and then his fabled toe drove the ball whistling just above the ground toward the corner of the goal, but the custodian with a full-length dive succeeded in stopping that bolt, and now the ball was already in his hands and eluding the nearest opponents. Martin sent it with all the force of his thigh and calf when a resounding punt that curved over the field to the roar of the stands. During the short half-time interval, the players sprawled on the ground, sucking on lemons, and when the teams changed goals, Martin, from his new position, tried again to make out Sonia and Darwin in the crowd. There was not much time for gawking, though, for the play immediately grew heated, and he constantly had to crouch on the alert. Several times, all doubled over, he caught cannonballs. Several times he fisted high shots away, and thus he kept his goal virgin to the end of the game, smiling with joy when a second before this final whistle, the opposing goalie fumbled the slippery ball, whereupon Armstrong promptly tapped it into the net. Everything was over. The spectators flooded the field, and he was still unable to spot Sonia and Darwin. Somewhere beyond the grandstand, among the departing crowds, he noticed Vladimir on his bike, weaving cautiously and tooting with his lips. "They decamped quite a while ago," he said in answer to Martin's question, "right after half-time, and here followed some quip about Darwin, in which Martin, however, did not hear the end, and at that moment Philpott, one of his teammates, squeezed by on a chugging motorcycle and offered him a lift. Martin got on behind, and Philpott accelerated. Might as well not have managed to turn that last one over the bar, thought Martin, winkling his face against the motley wind. He felt depressed and bitter, and when he had dismounted at the corner of his lane and was walking home, he ruminated with revulsion over the preceding day and Rose's craftiness, and felt even more hurt. They must be having tea somewhere, he muttered, but just in case looked into Darwin's room. Sonia was reclining on the couch, and at the moment he entered, her hand went up in a clutching flick, trying to catch a clothes moth as it flew past. "And Darwin?" asked Martin. "Alive, went out for some pastries," she answered, malevolently following her eyes the uncaught witticism speck. Whitish speck. "Shame you didn't stay to the end," said Martin, sinking into the abyss of an armchair. "We won, 1-0. "You ought to wash up," she remarked. "Just look at your knees, they're a sight, and you've tracked something back in there." "All right, just let me recover my breath," he breathed deeply several times, and got up with a tired grunt. "Wait a minute," said Sonia. "You've got to hear this. You'll die laughing. He just offered me his hand and heart. Of course, I knew it would happen, kept ripening, and finally burst." She stretched and glanced darkly at Martin, whose eyebrows had gone up. "Intelligent expression you have," she said, looking away. She continued, "I simply don't understand what he expected. Very nice chap, etc., but a log of real English oak. I'd die of boredom in a week. There it is, flying around again, that moth." Martin cleared his throat and said, "I don't believe you. I know you said yes." "You're crazy," shouted Sonia, sitting up and slapping the couch with both hands. "How can you imagine such a thing? Darwin is intelligent, perceptive, anything but a log," Martin said in a strained voice. She gave the couch another blow. "But he isn't a real person. Can't you see that, you idiot? This is getting downright insulting. He is not a person but a dummy. Nothing inside except heaps of humor. That's just fine for going to a dance, but in this long run, humor can get pretty exasperating." "He's a writer. Connoisseurs are raving about his stories," murmured Martin with an effort, and decided that now he had done his duty he tried enough to convince her, and that there was a limit to noble behavior. Exactly, for connoisseurs only. Very charming, very well written, but also superficial, so comfortable, so— Here Martin felt the rush of a radiant torrent that had burst through the locks. He remembered the tricky cross he had collected so nicely, remembered that the rose business was settled, that there was a banquet at the club that evening, that he was healthy and strong, that tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, and for many, many days more, life would go on replete with all kinds of happiness. All this overwhelmed him. In one dizzy instant, he merrily seized Sonia in the arms together with the cushion she had clutched at, and started kissing her moist teeth, her eyes, her cold nose, and she struggled and kicked, and her black, violet-scented hair kept getting in his mouth. At last, laughing loudly, he dropped her on the sofa. Here the door was pushed open. At first a foot appeared. Then, laden with goodies, Darwin entered. He tried to close the door with his foot, but dropped a paper sack out of which tumbled meringues. "Martin's been throwing cushions," said Sonia in a plaintive, breathless voice. 1-0 is not so grand after all. Why behave like a madman? 27. Next day, both Martin and Darwin had an armpit temperature of 105 Fahrenheit, aches and pains, sore throats, and a stinging of the ears, all symptoms of flu. Pleasant as it might to think the agent of contagion had probably been Sonia, both of them felt rotten, and Darwin, who steadfastly refused to stay in bed, looked in his colorful dressing gown like a heavyweight boxer, all red and disheveled after a long fight. But him, heroically disdaining contagion, brought medicines, while Martin, who had thrown a lap robe over his winter coat, neither of which did much to allay his chills, on top of his blanket, lay in bed with a scowl on his face, and in every pattern, in every relationship between chance objects, spots, or shadows, he saw human profiles, snoutish mugs, bourbon noses, negroid pouts. One wonders why fever specializes so assiduously in drawing rather vulgar caricatures. He would doze off and immediately be dancing the foxtrot with a skeleton, which, as it danced, began coming unscrewed and losing bones, as he had to snatch them up and hold them in place at least until the end of that dance, or else had to take an outrageous examination quite different from the one Martin had really to take a few months later in May. In the dream test, he was offered monstrous problems with large iron X's wrapped in cotton wool, while in the real one, in a spacious hall intersected by a dusty sunbeam, philology students had to knock off 3 compositions in 1 hour, and Martin, glancing now and then at the wall clock, wrote in his large round hand about Ivan the Terrible's gangman, about Baratinsky, about Peter I's reforms, and about Louis Nabokov. His life at Cambridge was nearing its end, and something of a radiant apotheosis attended the final days. While awaiting examination results, you could bask all afternoon in the sun, lying on cushions as you floated languidly down the Cam under majestic auspices of the pink chestnut trees. The spring Sonia moved in with her family to Berlin, where Zilanov had begun editing a Russian-language weekly, and now Martin, supine under the softly progressing branches, recalled his last trip to London. Darwin had not wanted to come. He indolently asked to have regards transmitted to Sonia, wriggled his fingers in the air, and plunged back in his book. When Martin arrived, the Zilanovs' house was in that dreary state of havoc that is so hateful to the elderly, homey dogs, fat dachshunds, for instance. The maid and a tousled-haired youth with a cigarette behind his ear were carrying a trunk downstairs. A tearful Irina sat alone in the living room, biting her nails and thinking impenetrable thoughts. Some glass object fell and broke in one of the bedrooms, and the phone in the study rang in immediate response, but nobody paid any attention to it. In the dining room, a plate, covered by another, meekly awaited, but what food it contained remained a mystery. Zilanov arrived from somewhere, wearing a black overcoat despite the warm weather, and sat down to write as coolly as if it were an ordinary day. A confirmed nomad, he evidently did not care in the least that in an hour it would be time to leave for the station, and that a crate of books, still to be nailed shut, stood in a corner. He just sat and wrote, in a current of air that stirred shreds of Excelsior and the sheets of old newspapers. Sonia was standing in the middle of her room, her hands pressed to her temples, her moody gaze shuttling between a large package and a suitcase that was already full. Martin sat on the low window ledge smoking. Several times either her mother or her aunt came in, looked for something, failed to find it, and went out. "Are you glad to be going to Berlin?" Martin gloomily asked, considering his cigarette, both in its excrescence of ash that resembled lichened fir foliage with an ominous sunset showing through. "I don't care," said Sonia, gauging mentally whether the suitcase would shut. "Sonia," said Martin a minute later. What is it?" she muttered, coming out of her trance, and suddenly began fussing fast, planning to take the suitcase by surprise with a sudden onslaught. "Sonia," said Martin, "is it really true?" Her aunt came in, looking in the corner, and replying negatively to somebody in the corridor, went out hurriedly without closing the door. "Can it really be true," said Martin, "that we'll never see each other again?" "That's for God to decide," replied Sonia absently. "Sonia," Martin began again. She glanced at him with a grimace. Or was it a smile? "You know," she said, "he sent back all my letters, all the photos, everything. Funny chap. He could have kept those letters. I spent half an hour ripping them up and flushing them down, and now the toilet's clogged." "You didn't behave well with him," grimly said Martin. "You can't build up a person's hopes and then turn him down." "You keep out," cried Sonia with a little squeal in her voice. "Hopes of what? How dare you talk about hopes? What vulgarity, what filth, and in general, why don't you stop pestering me? Try to sit on this bag instead," she added, one tone lower in pitch. Martin sat down on the lid and pressed hard. "Won't shut," he said hoarsely, "and I don't know why you have to fly into a rage like that. I just wanted to say—" At that point something clicked reluctantly, and without giving the suitcase time to collect itself, Sonia turned the little key in its lock. "Everything's fine now," she said. "Come over here, Martin. Let's have a heart-to-heart talk." Zilanov peeked into the room. "Where's Mother?" he asked. "Didn't I say to leave my desk alone? Now the ashtray has disappeared. It had 2 stamps in it." When he was gone, Martin took Sonia's hand in both hands, squeezed it between his palms, and heaved a melancholy sigh. "You're a very sweet boy after all," said Sonia. "We'll write to each other, and maybe sometime you'll come to Berlin, or perhaps we'll meet in Russia. Won't that be fun?" Martin kept shaking his head and felt the tears welling. Sonia snatched her hand away. "Oh, well, if you want to sulk," she said crossly, "do by all means, to your heart's content." "Oh, Sonia," he uttered sorrowfully, "just exactly what is it you want from me?" she asked, narrowing her eyes. "Please tell me what it is you want from me." Martin turned his head away and shrugged. "Listen," she said. "It's time to go down, time to leave, and your moping only exasperates me. For goodness sake, why can't we keep everything nice and simple?" "You'll get married in Berlin," Martin mumbled, hopelessly. As in a farce, the maid dashed in and took the suitcase. Miss Zilanov, already hated, appeared behind her. Time to go," she said. "You took everything in here? Didn't forget anything? This is dreadful," she addressed Martin. "We had planned on a leisurely departure tomorrow." She vanished, but for a while her voice in the passage went on explaining to somebody about her husband's urgent business, and Martin felt so piercingly, so ineffably saddened by all this commotion and disorder, that he actually yearned to bundle Sonia off, get rid of her as quickly as possible, and return to Cambridge in its lazy sunshine. Sonia smiled, took him by the shoulder, and kissed him on the bridge of his nose. "I don't know, maybe," she whispered, and quickly wriggling out of Martin's violent embrace, raised a warning finger. "Tu beau, doggy," she said, and then made big eyes, for at that moment from downstairs came the sound of awful, impossible, house-shaking sobs. Come on," hurried Sonia. "I can't understand why the poor child is so unhappy about moving away. Cut it out, darn it, let me go." At the bottom of the stairs, Irina was tossing, howling, clutching at the banister. Her mother kept coaxing her softly, "Ira, Irochka," while Zilanov, using an oft-tested expedient, took out his handkerchief, quickly made a long-eared fat knot, pulled the handkerchief over his hand, and maneuvered in such a way as to make a little fellow in nightshirt and cap cozily getting into bed. At the station she burst into tears again, only more quietly and hopelessly. Martin slipped her a box of candy that had actually been intended for Sonia. Zilanov had been sooner taken his seat than he opened a newspaper. Miss Zilanov and Miss Pavlov were counting suitcases with their eyes. With a clatter, the doors began closing. The train moved. Sonia thrust her head out, leaning her elbows on the lowered window, and for a few instants Martin walked alongside the car. Then he fell behind, and an already much diminished Sonia blew him a kiss, and Martin stumbled against some box on the platform. "Well, there they go," he sighed, and felt a certain relief. He made his way to the other station, bought the new issue of a humor magazine with a puppet, all-nose, chin, and hump on the cover, and when he extracted the last joke out of it, fixed his gaze on the gentle fields that were sliding past. my darling," he repeated several times, and gazing through a hot tear at the green scenery, he imagined how, after many adventures, he would arrive in Berlin, look up Sonia, and, like Othello, begin to tell a story of hair-breadth escapes, of most disastrous chances. "No, it can't go on like this," he said, rubbing his eyelid with a finger and tensing his upper lip. No, less talk and more action." Closing his eyes and wedging himself comfortably into the corner, he started preparing for a dangerous expedition, studying an imaginary map. No one knew what he planned to do. Darwin alone might be informed. Goodbye, good luck, and the northbound train moves. Amidst these preparations he fell asleep, and he once used to fall asleep while putting on football apparel in his reveries. It was dark when he arrived in Cambridge. Darwin was still reading the same book and yelled like a lion when Martin came in, and here Martin yielded so little mischievous temptation, which he was subsequently to pay for. Counterfeiting a pensive smile, he stared at nothing, and Darwin, having unhurriedly completed his yawn, gave him a curious look. "I am the happiest man in the world," said Martin, in a low voice full of feeling. "Oh, if I could only tell you everything." In a sense this was no lie, for when he had dozed off on the train he had dreamt a dream grown out of something that Sonia had said. In the dream she pressed his head to her smooth shoulder and bent over him, tickling him with her lips, murmuring warm, muffled words of tenderness, and now it was hard to separate fancy from fact. "Well, I'm very happy for you," said Darwin. A sudden embarrassment overcame Martin, and whistling to himself he went off to bed. A week later he received a postcard with a view of Brandenburg Gate crossed by Sonia's spidery handwriting, which he spent a long time deciphering, trying in vain to read a hidden meaning into trivial words. And now, gliding down the river beneath low-hanging boughs and bloom, Martin went back over his last meeting with her in London, analyzing it, testing it with different acids. A pleasant but not very fruitful labor. It was a hot day. The sun penetrated his closed eyelids with a languorous strawberry crimson. He could hear the restrained plash of water and the gentle far-off music of floating phonographs. Presently he opened his eyes, and in a flood of sunlight there was Darwin, reclining on the cushions opposite, dressed as he in white flannel pants and open-necked shirt. The pole propelling their punt was wielded by Vadim. His cracked pumps glistened with drops of water, and there was an intent expression on his sharp-featured face. He was fond of navigation, and now performed a sacred rite, as it were, skillfully, rhythmically manipulating the pole, pulling it out of the water with a methodical change of hold and bearing down on it anew. The punt glided between flowery banks. The transparent green water reflected now chestnut trees, now brambles, and milk-white bloom. Occasionally a petal would fall, and you could see its reflection hurrying up to meet it out of the watery depths, and then both would converge, lacy, soundlessly, if one discounted the cooing of the photographs. Other punts, or now and then a canoe, glided past. Martin noticed ahead an open, bright-colored parasol which rotated this way and that, but nothing was visible of the girl twirling it except a hand, incongruously clad in a white glove. Her punt was manned by a young chap with glasses, poling very inexpertly, so that the boat followed a weaving course, and Vadim seethed with contempt and did not know on which side to pass. At the very first bend, it headed inexorably for the bank. The convex parasol showed in profile, and Martin recognized Rose. "Look how amusing," he said, and Darwin, without moving the fat arms upon which his nape rested, turned his eyes in the direction of Martin's gaze. "You shall not say hello to her," he observed calmly. Martin smiled. "Oh, yes, I certainly will. If you do," drawled Darwin, "I'll knock your head off." There was a strange look in his eyes, and Martin felt uneasy, but for the very reason that Darwin's threat did not sound jocular or frighten him. Martin shouted as he floated past the punt entangled in the riverside shrubbery. "Hello, hello, Rose!" And she smiled silently, her eyes sparkling, her parasol spinning, and in his exertions the bespectacled chap dropped his pole with a splash, and the next moment they were concealed by the bend, and Martin again lay back and contemplated the sky. After they had glided in silence for some minutes, Darwin greeted somebody in his turn. "John," he roared, "paddle over here." John grinned and started backing water. This black-browed, crew-cut, portly young man with a gifted mathematician who had recently won a prize for one of his papers. He sat low in his pirogue, Vadim's nomenclature, moving a shiny paddle close to his boat's side. "I say, John," announced Darwin, "I've been challenged to a fight here, and I want you as second. We'll choose a quiet spot and land." "Right-os," answered John, without showing the least surprise, and as he paddled alongside, began a lengthy account about a student who had recently acquired a seaplane, and promptly crashed it during an attempt to take off in the narrow cam. Martin reclined in his cushions, motionless. Here it was, the familiar tremor and weakness in the legs. Maybe Darwin was joking, after all. What did he have to get so furious about? Vadim, immersed in the mystique of navigation, had apparently heard nothing. 3 or 4 bends later, Darwin asked him to head for shore. Everything was already drawing near. The river was deserted at that point. Vadim aimed the punt at the little green tongue of the land that projected from beneath a leafy canopy. They thumped gently to a stop. 28. Darwin jumped ashore first and helped Vadim moor the boat. Martin stretched, got up unhurriedly, and also debarked. "Began reading Chekhov yesterday," John said to him, wriggling his eyebrows. "Very grateful to you for the advice. Appealing, humane writer." "Oh, he certainly is," said Martin, and quickly thought to himself, "Is there going to be a fight?" "There," said Darwin, drawing near. "If we go through these bushes, we'll come out in a meadow, and we'll be out of sight of the river." Only here did Vadim understand what was about to take place. "Mamka will kill you," he said to Martin in Russian. "Nonsense," replied Martin. "I'm just as good a boxer as he is." "Forget about boxing," Vadim whispered feverishly. "Give him a good kick right away," and he specified exactly where. He was rooting for Martin solely out of patriotism. The little meadow, ringed by hazel trees, proved velvet smooth. Darwin rolled up his sleeves, but on second thought rolled them back down and took off his shirt, exposing a massive pink torso with a muscular gloss at the shoulders and a path of golden hairs down the middle of his broad chest. He tightened his belt and suddenly broke into a smile. "It's all a joke," thought Martin joyously, but just to be safe he too removed his shirt. His skin was of a creamier shade with numerous little birthmarks, common among Russians. Next to Darwin, he seemed sparer, even though solidly built and broad-shouldered. He pulled his cross over his head, gathered the chain in his palm, and thrust his handful of trickling gold in his pocket. The evening sun flooded his back with warmth. "How do you want it, with breathers?" asked John. Sprawling comfortably on the grass, Darwin glanced questioningly at Martin, who stood with spread legs and folded arms. "Makes no difference to me," remarked Martin, while through his mind rushed the thought, "No, it's the real thing. How ghastly!" Vadim slouched around restlessly with his hands in his pockets, sniffling, smirked uneasily, and then sat down cross-legged beside John. John took out his watch. "Anyway, they oughtn't to have more than 5 minutes in all," agreed Vadim. Vadim nodded in confusion. "Well, you can begin," said John. Fists clenched, legs flexed, the two started dancing around one another. Martin still could not imagine himself hitting Darwin in the face at that large, clean-shaven face with the soft wrinkles around the mouth. However, when Darwin's left snot shot out and caught Martin on the jaw, everything changed. All anxiety vanished, and he felt relaxed and radiant inside of the ringing in his head from the jolt it received, sang of Sonia, over whom in a sense they were fighting the stool. Dodging another lunge, he punched Darwin's gentle face, ducked under Darwin's retaliating right, attempted an uppercut, and received himself such a black, star-spangled blow in the eye that he staggered only just to manage to evade the most vicious of half-dozen swipes. He crouched, he feinted, he jabbed Darwin in the mouth so nicely that his knuckles felt the hardness of teeth through the wetness of his lips, but at once was published himself in the belly by running into what seemed the protruding end of an iron girder. They bounced away from each other and resumed circling. Darwin had a red trickle at the corner of his mouth. He spat twice and fight on. John, pensively puffing on the pipe, juxtaposed in his mind Darwin's experience and Martin's speed, and decided that if he were to choose between these two heavyweights in the ring, he would be inclined to bet on the elder. Martin's left eye was already closed and swollen. Both combatants were gauzy with sweat and smeared with blood. In the meantime, Vadim had got all worked up and was shouting excitedly in Russian. John shushed him. Bang! On the ear. Martin lost his balance, and as he was tumbling, Darwin managed to get him a second time, whereupon Martin sat down heavily on a pebbly patch, hurting his coccyx, but instantly sprang up and returned to the fray. Despite the buzzing pain in his head and the crimson fog in his eyes, Martin felt sure that he was inflicting more injury on Darwin than Darwin on him, but John, a lover of pugilism, already saw clearly that Darwin was only now getting into his stride, and that in a few moments the younger of the two would be down for good. But Martin miraculously withstood a series of resonant hooks and even managed to slam the other again on the mouth. He was panting now and not thinking too clearly, but what he saw before him was no longer carried by Darwin, and in fact had no human name at all, but had simply become a pink, slippery, rapidly moving mass that must be punched with every last bit of strength. He succeeded in planting yet another very solid and satisfying blow somewhere. He did not see where, but immediately the multitude of fists pummeled him at length from all sides. Wherever he turned, he stubbornly searched for a breath in this whirlwind, found one, hammered at a continuum of squelchy pulp, suddenly felt that his own head was flying off, slipped, and remained hanging on Darwin in a humid clinch. "Time," came John's voice from a remote space, and the fighters separated. Martin collapsed on the grass, and Darwin had bloodied his mouth, forming a grin, plumped down beside him and tentatively put his arm around Martin's shoulders, and both rose motionless, inclining their heads and breathing heavily. "You ought to wash up," said John, while Vadim approached cautiously and started examining their bruised faces. "Can you stand?" Darwin asked solicitously. Martin nodded, and leaning on him, straightened up. They trudged toward the river, arms across each other's shoulders. John patted them on their clammy bare backs. Vadim went on ahead and looked for a secluded cove. There Darwin helped Martin give face and frame a good wash. Then Martin did the same for him, and both kept asking each other in low, solicitous tones where it hurt if the water did not sting. "29. Dusk was deepening. The nightingales had begun bubbling. The dim meadows and the dark shrubs breathed dampness. The river mists engulfed John and his black canoe. Vadim, once again propelling the punt, a white, ghost-like figure in the gloom, wordlessly and with somnambulically smooth motion immersed this spectral pole. Martin and Darwin lay side by side on the cushions, limp, languid, swollen, staring with their three good eyes at the sky, across which a dark branch passed every now and then. And that sky and the branch and the barely splashing water, and the figure of Vadim mysteriously ennobled by his love of navigation, and the colored lights of the paper lanterns on the bows of passing punts, and the thought that in a few days Cambridge would end, and that perhaps the three of them were gliding for the last time along the narrow, misty river, all this merged in Martin's mind into something wondrous and spellbinding, and the leaden pain in his head and the ache in his shoulders struck him as having an exalted, romantic quality, for thus wounded Tristram had floated alone with his harp. One last bend, and there was the shore. The shore on which Martin landed was very fair, very bright, and full of variety. He knew, though, that, for example, Uncle Henry remained firmly convinced that these 3 years of aquatics in Cambridge had gone to waste because Martin had indulged in philological cruise, and not even a very distant one, instead of learning a useful profession, but worse to be an expert in Russian letters than a transportation engineer or a merchant. Actually, Uncle Henry's menagerie, and everyone has one, housed among other creatures a little black beast, and that bête noire was to him the 20th century. Now this amazed Martin, since in his opinion one could not even imagine a better century than the one in which he lived. No other epoch had such brilliance, such daring, such projects. Everything that had glimmered in the previous ages, the passion for exploration of unknown lands, the audacious experiments, the glorious exploits of disinterested curiosity, the scientists who went blind or were blown to bits, the heroic conspiracies, the struggle of one against many, now emerged with unprecedented force. The cool suicide of a man after having lost millions on the stock market struck Martin's imagination as much as, for instance, the death of a Roman general falling on his sword. An automobile advertisement brightly beckoning in a wild, picturesque gorge from an absolutely inaccessible spot on an alpine cliff thrilled him to tears. The complacent and affectionate nature of the very complicated and very simple machines, like the tractor and the linotype, for example, induced him to reflect that the good in mankind was so contagious that it infected metal. When at an amazing height in the blue sky above the city, a mosquito-sized airplane emitted fluffy milk-white letters 100 times as big as it, repeating in divine dimensions the flourish of a firm's name, Martin was filled with a sense of marvel and awe. But Uncle Henry, as if throwing tidbits to his black Bessie, spoke with horror and revulsion about the twilight of Europe, about post-war fatigue, about our practical age, and about the invasion of inanimate machines. In his imagination there existed some diabolical connection between the foxtrot and the skyscrapers on one side, and women's fashions and cocktails on the other. Furthermore, Uncle Henry had the impression he lived of an age of terrible haste, and it was particularly funny when he chatted about this haste on a summer day, at the edge of a mountain road, with the hotel priest, while the clouds sailed serenely on an abbey's cold, old pink horse, shaking off flies with a tinkle, blinking its white eyelashes, would lower its head in a movement full of ineffable charm and munch succulently on the roadside grass, with its skin twitching or hoof shifting now and then, and if the talk about the mad haste of our days, about the almighty dollar, about the Argentines who seduced all the girls of Switzerland, dragged on too long, and the last tender stalk along coarser ones had been eaten at a given spot, it would move ahead a little, accompanied by the creak of the gig's high wheels, and Martin could not take his eyes off the gentle equine lips and the blades of grass caught in the bit. Here, this young man, for example, Uncle Henry would say, indicating Martin with his walking stick, he has finished college, one of the most expensive colleges in the world, and you ask him what he has learned, what he is prepared for. I absolutely don't know what he is going to do next. In my time, young men became doctors, soldiers, notaries, while he is probably dreaming of being an aviator or a gigolo. Martin had no idea exactly he served as an example of, but the abbé apparently understood Uncle Henry's paradoxes and smiled commiseratingly. Sometimes Martin was so irritated by talk of this kind that he was ready to say something rude to his uncle, who was also, alas, his stepfather, but would stop in time, for he had noticed the look that appeared on his mother's face whenever Henry waxed eloquent at dinner. That look contained a faint trace of friendly raillery, a certain sadness, and a mute appeal to forgive the crank, and yet something else inexpressible and very wise. Martin would keep still, mentally answering Uncle Henry like this, for example. It's not true that I devoted my time to trifles at Cambridge. It's not true that I did not learn anything. Columbus before trying to take hold of his east ear across the west shoulder, traveled to Iceland incognito to gather certain information, knowing that the sailors were a canny and far-ranging breed. I too planned to explore a distant land. His mother did not pester him with the tedious talk of which Uncle Henry was so fond. She did not inquire what occupation he would choose, feeling as she did that all this would somehow work out by itself. She was satisfied with the happiness at hand of his being with her now, healthy, broad-shouldered, and tanned, of his slamming away at tennis, speaking in a bass voice, shaving daily, and making young, bright-eyed Madame Guichard, a local merchant's wife, blush as red as a poppy. Sometimes she wondered when Russia would at last snap out of the evil dream, when the striped pole of the frontier gate would rise and everyone return and resume its former place. And goodness, how the trees have grown, how the house has shrunk. What sorrow and joy, what a smell of earth. In the morning she would wait for the postman just as avidly as during her son's years at Cambridge, and now when a letter came from Martin, and it was not often, in an office envelope addressed in a spidery hand that bearing a Berlin postmark, she felt the keenest joy, and snatching the letter, hurried to his room. Martin still lay in his bed, very tousled, soaking on a cigarette with his hand at his chin. He saw in the mirror the sun-bright wound in the opening door, and that special expression on his mother's pink freckled face, by the fold of her lips, tightly compressed but ready to spread into a smile. He could tell there was a letter. "Nothing for you today," Miss Edelweiss would lightly say, holding one hand behind her back, but her son's impatient fingers were already reaching out, and beaming she would press the envelope to her chest, and both would laugh. Then, not wishing to spoil his enjoyment, she would go to the window, lean out on its sill, cupping her face in her hands, and gaze with a feeling of complete happiness at the mountains, and in particular at one distant rosy peak that was visible only from this window. Martin, who had consumed the letter in one gulp, pretended to be considerably happier than he actually was, so that his mother imagined those letters from the little Silanov girl to be full of tenderness, and would probably have not felt sadly hurt if she ever got to read them. She remembered the Silanov girl with strange clarity, a black-haired, pale little thing who was always sick with an inflamed throat, or convalescing after one, her neck either bandaged or yellow from iodine. She remembered how she had once taken 10-year-old Martin to a Christmas party at the Zilanovs' St. Petersburg flat, and little Sonia was wearing a lacy white dress with a broad silk sash around their hips. As for Martin, he did not remember this at all. There had been many Christmas parties, and they emerged in his memory. Only one thing remained very vivid, for it had recurred every time, his mother saying it was time to go home, thrusting her fingers inside the collar of his sailor suit from behind to see if he was not too sweaty after all the running, while he, with a huge gold-papered cracker, kept trying to wrench himself free. But his mother's grip was tenacious, and presently his overpants, which reached nearly to his armpits, were being pulled on, and on went his overshoes and his fur coat, with its tight closing hook at the throat and hideously tickly Caucasian hood, and next minute there was the street lamp's frosty rainbow running across the window of the close carriage. It thrilled Martin to note the expression of his mother's eyes was the same now as then, that now too she touched his neck when he came home after tennis, and that she brought Sonia's letter with the same tenderness as she had once brought in its long cardboard box an air rifle ordered from England. The rifle had turned out to be not quite as he had expected, not matching exactly its foredream, just as now the letters from Sonia were not the kind he would have liked. She wrote, as it were, in abrupt jerks, without a single mystery-breathing phrase, and he had to be content with such remarks as, "I often recall good old Cambridge," or, "Best of everything, my dear little flower, give me your paw to shake." She told him that she had an office job, typing in shorthand, that they were having a very difficult time with Irina, constant hysterics, that her father had not got anywhere with his Russian-language newspaper, and was now setting up a publishing business, books by emigre writers, that there was never a penny in the house, which was rather sad, that they had many friends, which lots of fun, that the streetcars in Berlin were green, and the Berliners played tennis and braces and starched collars. Martin's endurance lasted all through summer, fall, and winter. Then, in mid-April, in 1923, and on his 21st birthday, he announced to Uncle Henry that he was leaving for Berlin. The latter looked dour, and said with displeasure, "To me, mon ami, that seems devoid of all sense. You will always have time to see Europe. In point of fact, I was going to take you and your mother to Italy next autumn. But you can't go on loafing forever. In short, I was going to suggest that you try your youthful powers in Geneva. Martin knew full well what was meant. Several times already this dismal subject had crept stealthily forth. It concerned some commercial firm or other belonging to the Petit brothers, with whom Uncle Henry had business relations. That you try Tejeune forces, Uncle Henry repeated. In this cruel age, in this very practical age, a young man must learn to earn his bread and elbow his way through life. You have a solid knowledge of the English language. Foreign correspondence in the world of affairs is a most interesting thing. As for Berlin, your German is not much improved, has it? I can't see what you are going to do there. Suppose I do nothing, Martin said gloomily. Uncle Henry looked at him with surprise. That's a bizarre answer. I don't know what your father would have thought of an answer like that. I think he would be as astonished as I am that a young man full of sap and health despises all work. Please understand, he hastily added, noticing that Martin had reddened unpleasantly. I am not being stingy. Je ne suis pas mesquin. I am rich enough, thank God, to provide for you. I make a duty and a joy of it, but it would be folly not to take a job. Europe is passing through an unbelievable crisis, and a man can lose a fortune in the twinkling of an eye. That's the way it is, and you can do nothing about it. I don't need your money, Martin said softly and rudely. Uncle Henry pretended not to hear, but tears welled in his eyes. Don't you have any ambition at all? Don't you ever think about making a career? We Edelweisses always knew how to work. Your grandfather began as a poor tutor, teaching French at the Princess Russes. Then he proposed to our grandmother. Her parents threw him out of the house, and back he comes a year later, the director of an export company, and then obviously all obstacles were swept away. I don't need your money, repeated Martin, even more softly. And as for grandfather, there's nothing but a silly family legend, and you know it. What's the matter with him? What's the matter with him? Uncle Henry muttered in fright. What right do you have to offend me like this? What wrong have I done to you? I, who have always, the short of the matter is I'm going to Berlin. Martin interrupted and left the room, trembling. That evening there was a reconciliation, embraces, nose blowing, emotional throat clearing, but Martin stood his guard. His mother, who sensed his longing to see Sonia, proved to be an ally and smiled bravely as he got into the car. Hardly had the house disappeared from view when Martin changed places with the chauffeur. Holding the wheel delicately, almost tenderly, as if it were something alive and precious, and watching the powerful car gobble up the road, he experienced nearly the same sensation as when in childhood, seated on the floor of his feet, resting his piano pedals. He would hold the stool with its round revolving seat between his legs and handle it like a steering wheel, taking splendid curves at full speed, pushing the pedal again and again, which made the piano hum, and slitting his eyes against the imaginary wind. Then in German Express, where between the corridor windows hung the small maps of regions a train did not pass through, Martin relished the journey, eating chocolate, smoking, poking his cigarette butt under the metal lid of the ashtray, filled with the remains of cigar. It was night by the time he neared Berlin, looking from the train into the wet, lighted streets. He relived his childhood impression of Berlin, whose fortunate inhabitants could enjoy daily, if they wished, the sight of trains with the fabulous destinations gliding across a black bridge over a humdrum thoroughfare. In this respect, Berlin differed from St. Petersburg, where railroad operations were concealed like a secret rite. A week later, though, when his eyes had got used to the city, Martin was already powerless to reconstruct that perspective from which its features had seemed familiar. It was when you meet someone you have not seen for years. First you recognized his figure and his voice, and then you look more closely, and there, before your eyes, the transformation imperceptibly wrought by time is run to in quick display. Features alter, likeness deteriorates, and you have before you a stranger looking smug after having devoured his young and fragile double, whom it will henceforth be hard to picture unless chance comes to the rescue. When Martin deliberately visited Berlin at that intersection, that square which he had seen as a child, there was nothing that gave him the least shiver or excitement, but on the other hand, a chance whiff of coal or automobile exhaust, a certain special pale hue of the sky through which a lace curtain or the shutter of the window panes awakened in passing truck instantly brought back the essence of a city hotel and drab mourning, part of an image that Berlin had once impressed upon him. The toy shops of the once elegant Friedrichstrasse had thinned out and lost their sparkle, and the locomotives and their windows looked smaller and shabbier. The pavement of this street had been torn up, and the short-sleeved workmen were drilling and digging deep smoky holes so that you had to pick your way over planking, sometimes even across loose sand. And the panopticon of waxworks in the Unter den Linden, the man in a shroud energetically climbing out of his grave, and the Iron Maiden, the instrument of strong and hard torture, had lost their ghoulish charm. Martin went to the Kurfürstendamm to look for that enormous roller-skating rink that he remembered so well, with its rumble of wheels, instructors in red uniforms, bandshell, slightly salty mocha cake served in the encircling boxes, and the pas de patineurs that he used to dance to any kind of music, flexing now with his right, now with his left skate-shod leg. And what a spill he took once, only to find a dozen years had been enough to abolish it completely. The Kurfürstendamm itself had changed too, maturing, growing longer, and somewhere, perhaps beneath a new building, lay the grave of a 20-court tennis establishment where Martin had been a couple of times with his mother, who would accompany her underhand service with a bright-voiced play, and whose skirt would rustle as she ran. Now, without even leaving the city limits, he could reach the Grunwald, where the Zillanovs lived, to learn from Sonia that it was pointless to go to Wertheim's for his shopping, and that it was by no means obligatory to visit the Winter Garden, under whose fabulous star-dusted black ceiling tight-corseted Prussian officers sat at lighted tables in the boxes, while on stage 12 bare-legged girls sang with brassy voices and undulated with linked arms from right to left and back again, kicking up 12 light legs, and little Martin had uttered a soft exclamation of surprise upon recognizing in them the demure, pretty English misses who, like him, went skating daily at the wooden rink. But perhaps the most unexpected thing about this new, much-expanded post-war Berlin, so peaceful, rustic, and bumbling, compared to the compact and elegant city of Martin's childhood, was the free-mannered, loud-voiced Russia that chattered everywhere, in the trams, in the shops, on the street corners, on the balconies of apartment houses, some 10 years before in one of his prophetic daydreams. And any person with a lot of imagination has prophetic daydreams occasionally, such in the statistics of daydreams. Martin, a schoolboy in the secure St. Petersburg of 1913, imagined himself in years to come as an exile, and felt tears rising when on the strange dim railway platform of his reverie he unexpectedly encountered whom? A compatriot, sitting on a trunk. On a night of sliverings and delays, and what a marvelous talk they had. For the roles of these fellow exiles he simply chose Russians he had noticed during the earlier trip abroad, a family in Biarritz, complete with governess, tutor, clean-shaven valet, and brown dachshund, a fascinating fair-haired lady at the Kaiserhof in Berlin, or in the corridor of the Nord Express an old gentleman in a black skullcap, whom Martin's father had identified in a whisper as the writer Boborkian. Then, having selected for them appropriate costumes and speeches, he would dispatch them to meetings with himself in the remotest parts of the world. Today, in 1923, that chance fantasy, the consequence of heaven knows what children's book, found full incarnation, marked even by some overplaying. When the fat, heavily made-up Russian lady in the tram hung with blank dejection from her strap and volleyed over her shoulder some resounding Russian to her companion, an old man with a grey mustache, astounding, really astounding. How not one of these ill-bred foreigners offers his seat? Martin jumped up, and with a radiant smile, repeating what he had rehearsed in his boyhood fantasies, exclaimed, "Pashalushka," and instantly growing pale from the experienced thrill, clutched the strap in his turn. The peaceable Germans, whom the lady had called ill-bred, were all tired, hungry working people, and the grey sandwiches they chewed in the streetcar, even if they did irritate Russians, were indispensable. For real diners were expensive that year of monstrous inflation, and when Martin changed a dollar note in the tram, instead of investing that dollar in real estate, the conductor's hands would shake with amazement and joy. Martin earned his American valuta in a special way, which made him very proud. True, the labor was arduous. Ever since May, when he had stumbled upon that job, thanks to Kinderman, a charming Russian German, who for a couple of years already had been teaching tennis to whatever wealthy clients had turned up, and until mid-October, when he left to spend the winter with his mother, and then again in the spring of 1924, Martin worked almost daily from early morning to sunset, Holding 5 balls in his left hand, Kinderman managed to hold 6, and sending them one by one across the net with an identical smooth stroke of the racket, while the tense middle-aged pupil, male or female, on the other side of the net swung diligently and as often did not hit anything. At first Martin would get so tired, his right shoulder would ache, and his feet burn so badly, that as soon as he had earned his $5 or $6 he would go to bed. His hair grew lighter and his skin darker from the sun, so that he seemed a negative of himself. His landlady, a major's widow, from whom he concealed his profession, so as to seem more mysterious, supposed that the poor fellow, like many cultured people, at last was obliged to work as a laborer, logging rocks, for instance. Hence the suntan was embarrassed about it, as would be any refined person. In the evening, with genteel sighs, she would treat him to sausage that her daughter sent from the Pomeranian estate. The lady was 6 feet tall, with a ruddy complexion, used cologne on Sundays, and kept a parrot and a tortoise in her room. She considered Martin an ideal roomer. He was seldom at home, did not receive guests, and never used the bath. The latter was amply replaced by the shower at the tennis club and the lake in Grunwald. This bath was plastered with the landlady's hair on the inside, anonymous rags dried on the clothesline overhead, and an old, dusty, rusted bicycle leaned against the opposite wall. Moreover, it was no easy task getting there. One had to follow a long, dark corridor with an extraordinary number of corners, and piled full of all sorts of junk. Martin's room, on the other hand, was not bad at all, and had its amusing side. It contained such objects of luxury as an upright piano, looked tight from time immemorial, and a massive complicated barometer that had stopped working a couple of years before the war, while on the green wall above the couch, like a constant, benevolent reminder, the same naked old chap armed with a trident rose out of his Bacchanalian waves as he did, although in a plainer frame, on the wall of the Zillanage parlor. "32. The first time Martin visited them and saw their cheap, dingy flat, consisting of 4 rooms and a kitchen, where a strange Sonia with a different hairdo sat on the table, swinging her legs in their darned-up stockings, sniffling and peeling potatoes, Martin realized that he could expect nothing but sorrows from Sonia, and that his Berlin trip was pointless. Everything about her was unfamiliar. The bronze carrot-legged sweater, the exposed ears, the stuffy voice. She was in the throes of a bad cold, and the skin was red around her nostrils. She would stop peeling to blow her nose, give a dejected grunt, and slice off a new spiral of brown skin with her knife. For supper they had buckwheat groats and margarine instead of butter. Irina came to the table holding a kitten from which she was inseparable, and greeted Martin with a joyous and dreadful laugh. Both mothers had aged during the past year and had grown to resemble each other even more. Only Zillanov was his still old self, and cut into the bread as mightily as ever. "I hear," Crunch Creek, "that Gruzhinov is in Lausanne. Did you, Creek, happen to run into him? Great friend of mine, and remarkably strong-willed, determined person." Martin had not the faintest notion of who Gruzhinov was, but did not ask any questions for fear of committing a blunder. After dinner, Sonia washed the plates and he dried them, breaking one. "It's an impossible situation," she exclaimed, and elucidated. "I mean not our finances, but my nose. I can't breathe through it. The financial situation is also pretty bad for that matter." Then she accompanied him downstairs to unlock the front door. At the press of a button there was a cute click, and the staircase lights flashed on, and Martin kept clearing his throat and could not imagine a single word of the many he had prepared. Evenings of a quite different nature followed. A multitude of guests, dancing to records, dancing in a nearby cafe, the murk of the corner cinema. New people materialized around Martin on all sides. Nebulae gave birth to worlds. Definite labels and features were found in the Russian substance scattered around Berlin. For all those elements of expatriation which so excited Martin, be it merely a snatch of routine conversations amid the shoving sidewalk crowd, a chameleon word, such as that Russified plural of its wandering accent, dollary, dollara, or a squabbling of couples recitative caught in passing, and I'm telling you, for a female voice, "Oh, have it your way," or male voice, or on the summer night a man with his head thrown back, clapping his hands under a lighted window and shouting a resonant name in patronymic that made the whole street vibrate and caused a taxi to emit a nervous squeal and shy to one side after nearly running over a vociferous visitor who had by now backed to the center of the asphalt, the better to see if the person he needed would appear like Punch in the window. Through the Zelenovs, Martin met people among whom he first felt ignorant and alien. In a certain sense, he experienced all over again that he had embarrassed him when he first saw the Zelenovs in London, and now when at the apartment of Stepan Bubinov, the talk rolled on in great waves, full of allusions to modern authors, and knowledgeable Sonia cast at Martin a sidelong glance of ironic compassion. Martin blushed. Walter was about to launch his own frail little contribution on the billows of other people's speeches, but feared it would capsize immediately, and so kept still. In compensation, shamed by the backwardness of his erudition, he devoted every hour of rain to reading, and soon became familiar with that special smell, the smell of prison libraries, which emanated from Soviet literature. The writer Bubnov, who used to point out with satisfaction how many distinguished Russian literary names of the 20th century began with the letter B, was a bearish, balding man of 30, with a huge forehead, deep-set eyes, and a square chin. He smoked a pipe, sucking his cheeks deeply with every puff, wore an old black bow tie, and considered Martin a fop and a foreigner. As to Martin, he was much taken with Bubnov's energetic, round-toned delivery, and with his quite justified frame. Bubnov, whose writing career had begun in exile, had already had 3 excellent novels brought out by a Russian immigrant publisher in Berlin, and was now writing a 4th. Its hero was Christopher Columbus, or to be more exact, a Muscovite scrivener who, after many escapades, had miraculously ended up as a sailor in one of Columbus's caravels. Bubnov knew no language other than Russian, so that when he had to go to the state library for his research and Martin happened to be free, he willingly took him along. Martin's command of German being mediocre, he was glad when his text chanced to be in French, English, or better still Italian. True, he knew that language even less than German, but he particularly prized his scant knowledge, remembering how he used to read Dante with his melancholy Teddy's assistance. Bubnov's flat was frequented by the emigre literary set. Fictionists, journalists, pimply young poets, and Bubnov's opinion were all the people of middling talent, and he reigned over them justly, hearing out with his hand over his eyes yet another poem about nostalgia for the homeland, or recollections of St. Petersburg for the bronze horseman inevitably present, and then saying, as he unscreened his beetling brows and kneaded his chin, "Yes, that's good," then focusing his pale hazel eyes on some fixed point, he would repeat "good" with a less convinced intonation, and once again changing the direction of his gaze, he would say, "Not bad," and then, "only you make Petersburg a little too portable," and thus gradually lowering his evaluation, he would reach the point where he muttered in hollow tones with a sigh, "That stuff is all wrong, all unnecessary," and dejectedly shake his head, upon which, abruptly, with vivid enthusiasm, he would thunder out a poem by Pushkin. Once, when a young poet took offense and objected, "That's by Pushkin, and this is by me," Bubnov thought for a moment and replied, "Still yours is worse." Then again there would be occasions when some newcomer brought a really fine piece, whereupon Bubnov, especially the piece were in prose, would grow strangely grim and remain out of sorts for several days. Bubnov's friendship with Martin, who never wrote anything except letters to his mother, and for this who is dubbed by wit our Madame de Sévigné, remained sincere and free of misgivings. There was even a night when, relaxed and transparent after his 3rd mug of Pilsner, Bubnov began talking dreamily, and this brought back a campfire of the Crimea mountains, about a girl whose soul was a song, whose dark eyes sang, and whose skin was pale like a precious porcelain. Then, with a fierce look, he added, "Yes, that's trite, that's nauseous, ugh. Despite me, if you like, I may lack all talent, but I'm in love with her. Her name is like a church dome, like the swish of doves' wings. I see radiant light in her name, that special light, the compendium of the ancient Kedar sages. A light from the east. Ah, that's a great mystery, an awesome mystery." Lowering his voice to a demented whisper, he added, "A woman's charm is a terrible thing, you understand me, terrible, and her poor little slippers are worn at that heel." Yes, worn down. Martin felt uncomfortable and nodded in silence. In Bubnov's company he always had a strange feeling, as if it were all a dream, and somehow he did not have to complete faith either in him or in the Kedar elders. Sonia's other acquaintances, for example, jolly but bright Kalisterov, a former officer now in the automobile transport business, or the pleasant, fair-skinned, and buxom Vertikhanov girl who played the guitar and sang "There's a Volga High Cliff" in rich contralto, or young Ilogelevich, an intelligent, viperous, taciturn youth in horn-rimmed glasses who had read Proust and Joyce, were far less complicated than Bubnov. Mixed in with these friends of Sonya's were the elderly acquaintances of her parents, all respectable, politically active, pure-hearted people, fully deserving a future obituary of 100 limpid lines. But when one July day old Ilogelevich heavily fell prone on the sidewalk, dead of heart failure, and the emigre papers carried a great deal of stuff about the irreplaceable loss, and the true toiler, and Mikhail Platonovich Zilanov, improperly hatless and his briefcase under his arm, walked in the vanguard of the funeral procession. Among the roses and the black marble of Jewish graves, Martin had the impression that the obituary writer's words were, "He burned with love for Russia," or "He always held high his pen," something how debased and deceased, inasmuch as those same words would have been equally applicable both to Zilanov and to the venerable necrologist himself. Most of all, Martin felt sorry for the originality of the deceased, who was truly irreplaceable. His gestures, his beard, his sculpturesque wrinkles, the sudden shy smile, the jacket button that hung by a thread, and his way of licking a stamp with his entire tongue before sticking it to the envelope and banging it with his fist. In a certain sense, this was all of greater value than the social merits for which there existed such easy little cliches, and with an odd shift of thought, Martin swore to himself that he himself would never join a political party or attend a meeting, that he would never be the personage who is given the floor, or who adjourns the proceedings, while reveling in the joys of civic virtues. And often Martin would marvel at his inability to mention his long-treasured secret plans to Zilanov, or to Zilanov's friends, or to any of those industrious, upstanding Russians so full of disinterested love for their country.